I just want to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the topic of elevating your cybersecurity risk management awareness and capabilities. Just going to feature a colleague and friend of mine, Tim Lee, who is truly an expert on this topic. I want to thank all of you for joining. And also I want to thank those of you who were able to attend our last webinar that featured Greg Keith. Again, my name is Cynthia Vitters. I lead the enterprise risk management practice at Deloitte for government public services. And I know many of you, so nice to see all of you. I've been a longtime advocate around the advancement of risk management implementation across both the public and private sector. And so, today, just a couple words about today's webinar. It is a complimentary preview for a new risk management certificate that the Smith School and Deloitte are launching, and it will be called Maryland Smith School Federal Risk Academy. We're very excited about this collaboration between the Smith School and Deloitte, which is really aimed at strengthening and sharpening mid-career professional skills and applying risk management topics. When we kick off the program, it's going to feature 7 modules that will be presented in a live format. And some of the topics that we'll be covering include building a sustainable risk management program, ERM and credit risk, cyber risk and mitigation for regulators, risk modeling and governance, liquidity and capital risk, operational and regulatory risk management, and last but not least, climate change. So again, be on the lookout for more information about this new program that we'll be launching. But the launch date is now January 11th of 2022. Without any further ado, I'm actually going to turn this over to Cliff Rossi, who is going to introduce our topic and our guest, Tim Lee. So thanks, Cliff, over to you.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. And again, thanks to the folks at Deloitte for collaborating with us on this journey around risk management and the programs that we're offering here. First of all, just by way of quick introduction, I'm a professor of the practice and an executive in residence at the Smith School. Before that, I was the chief risk officer at several of the largest financial institutions in the country for about 23 years or so. So bringing that practitioner-based view along with our academic views to our risk management programs. And thanks, Tim, again, for joining the webinar. Let me just kind of put some things in perspective here as we kind of kick this discussion off. Whether you work at a government agency, corporation, financial services company, NGO, whatever it might be, cyber threats, you see it every day, right, are one of the most worrisome risks to risk managers. And to put it in perspective, a recent report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies has estimated that global losses from cyber attacks in 2020 were $1 trillion. Shocking number, at least to myself, but big number, right? Big dollars here. Ransomware costs to the U.S. To U.S. victims were estimated last year to be in the neighborhood of like $1.5 billion. So we're talking real money here beyond the actual other adverse effects to these types of things. And they're no longer confined to just simple one-off hacks of, like in the old days, it used to be things like ATM attacks, phishing, malware events, and the like, but are now increasingly conducted by fairly sophisticated actors and groups that lie beyond the reach of our law enforcement in many cases. And so you've all seen, right, headline grabbing events on vital supply chains, such as the Colonial Pipeline. Spend a little bit of time today talking about that. JBS, meat packing and ransomware attacks. They just underscore the potential vulnerability of our systems infrastructure to these kinds of events. And so for today's discussion, as Cynthia mentioned, we brought in Tim Lee from Deloitte, seasoned expert in risk management, cyber risk management, to give us his perspective on the nature of these risks and how to approach proactive management of cyber threats at your organization. So just a little bit about Tim. Tim's a principal at Deloitte and is their government and public services industry strategic growth offering leader for cyber. And in that capacity, he leads growth initiatives for the firm's cyber solutions and capabilities for federal government, state and local government, and higher education clients. Been in the industry for more than 20 years. I could go on and on about his background. Needless to say, he is definitely an expert in this space, focusing on cyber strategy, data protection, cloud security, digital identity, cyber ops, and regulatory compliance. And most important, perhaps, is that he is a UMD alum from the Clark School of Engineering. So, Tim, again, thank you very much for being here and imparting your wisdom with us today on this very, very important topic. One last word to the attendees, just in terms of logistics. If you have questions for Tim, please go ahead, put them in the chat. I'll pick them up at the end of our conversation in the last 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll pose those back to Tim to make sure that we kind of get those taken care of. So to level set everyone, Tim, let me kind of kick this off to you and say, or ask you rather, how has the cyber landscape changed over the last couple of years? That is, can you just walk us through some of the major types of cyber threats that are out there, some of the ways cyber criminals are penetrating these systems, and who the major players are for that matter? So kick that to you.
Great. Well, first off, thanks, Cliff. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind words, and certainly thank you for having me. Great question, Cliff. And I think you actually did a good job in your intro highlighting some of the emerging threats as you were talking about things like ransomware and other events. I thought maybe it would be helpful to share maybe some of the drivers that I think that are instantiating some of those threats. I think first and foremost, the ubiquity of connectivity, right? Everything is now connected. We are in the new industrial revolution, Industry 4.0, right? Which has really been propagated by the internet. And so physical and IT worlds have now converged, right? So you now have these physical systems that could be smart grids, pipelines, other industrial control systems, home devices that we all have, right? That I have a ton in my office right now. All these things are now connected. And that means they're potentially targets for compromise from anywhere in the world. And the challenge a lot of times for some of these big physical systems, when I think about it, Cliff, is that they often were engineered for long lifespans, years, right? When you think about the IT world and home devices or in IT infrastructure, we recirculate these things every year, right? Everyone gets a new iPhone every year or 2 years, et cetera. But when you think about, some of these large physical systems, they're engineered for years. And so that's very incongruent with the cyber threat landscape, which is always evolving in real time. And so due to system complexity, available downtime, they're difficult to patch and update, right? And that makes them a lot more vulnerable. And so, when we think about in cyber, we used to talk about the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That makes availability much more important. When traditionally, as you were mentioning earlier, people thought about stealing data, personal data, or whatnot. That kind of strived and you thought about confidentiality. We've now pivoted to think more about availability. We've also started to think more about integrity too, because now with the internet, and the internet was all about propagating information, I now have threats around misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, right? So maliciously false information or false information without necessarily malicious intent. These are all things I think that are disrupting things in the cyber realm as well, because they're being propagated through that cyber domain. So I think, our adversaries, frankly, are not changing, right? So you both have cyber criminals that are looking to, make a buck, make a dollar here or there. But then you also have nation state adversaries, right, that are obviously looking to disrupt our country, our people, et cetera. And so, bottom line is, I don't know that the adversaries and the threats have changed per se, but the environment and the ecosystems have changed. You talked about the supply chain. Our supply chains are so complex now, right, to the nth degree where, I don't even know that we all know what our supply chains are, right, and the ecosystems that we operate in. And so I think those have caused a lot of disruption across the board.
Yeah, it reminds me too that there's always this evolution. I mean, and again, I'm not the expert here, but from what I see, there has been a significant upgrading of the bad actors out there in terms of their level of sophistication and capabilities from what we've seen in the past. So you couple that with this availability of all things internet connected, and it does create a pretty sizable threat out there for any organization or individual for that matter. Not here to scare people, but that's the thing that I also see, right? Is this kind of like level of sophistication that's changed over time. Does that resonate with you? Or?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And I think about innovation, right? Innovation has certainly pushed businesses forward, pushed governments forward, right? From a mission perspective. but innovation can also be used in the wrong hands, right? Innovation can be used in the hands of our adversaries. And so everything that we do to innovate ourselves, whether that's advanced analytics, these new cognitive capabilities, whatever we might be doing, those put in the hands of the adversaries are just as deadly, right? And I think that's really important to kind of consider and understand. Traditionally, as a cyber professional, we didn't like innovation. Why? Because innovation was scary, right? Because innovation meant something I didn't understand, something I didn't know how to secure. So it used to be, many years ago when I first kind of grew up in the industry, people would say, well, I'd rather not innovate because it's harder to secure. And so what did we used to say? We used to say, well, the most secure computer was the one that wasn't connected, right? Well, we know that can't be reality today, right? We have to ride along with the things that are happening in innovation, and cyber certainly should not be about stopping things. It should be about starting things, but put it in the hands of adversaries, I think that can be certainly a challenge as well. I always think of cyber adversaries as being kind of leading edge. You think about bots and robotics, process automation. People talk a lot about this. Cyber adversaries were using that years ago to create automated accounts, right? To do things, or even going on Ticketmaster to buy tickets up and do bad things that they shouldn't be doing. And so all things, I think, that in the hands of kind of folks with the wrong intent, that could be very dangerous as well.
Well, the president's come out with a new executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, and I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think the executive order has been great in laying out some key foundational elements that we should be thinking about, right, in this country, and that government agencies should be propagating and moving forward on. First and foremost is supply chain, right? There's a lot of focus on supply chain, understanding your supply chain. Like I said earlier, though, I think the supply chain answer is pretty complex, though. I think I always, when I drive, I look in my rearview mirror, right? And the quote is, objects in the mirror are closer than they may appear. There's a lot of things that happen in the cyber domain that you think are unrelated to you and may not impact you. You're like, hey, that was that organization, didn't impact me. When in fact, it actually may, right? Let's look at the SolarWinds incident. That initially started off as a separate incident, and people thought that was localized. And they realized, oh, well, the reason this happened was because of a SolarWinds incident. And now that propagated all of a sudden to a much bigger and broader issue. So supply chain certainly is going to be really important. The executive order also highlighted the concept of zero trust, which is, I think, interesting because, traditionally in cyber, we've always had this mentality of not trusting things. And so now this concept is of zero trust, never trust and always verify. The principles of zero trust, I don't think have changed. The basic principles are still the same from what we've all classically used and leveraged. But how you apply these principles in your environment at a very granular level, right, is going to make zero trust a challenge and difficult. But I'm a big proponent of zero trust at these granular use case levels, and we can certainly talk more about kind of what that means. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting about the executive order too is this concept of information sharing. I don't know, I have a lot of hopes about what that can be for us, right, as a country. Sharing information, collaborating on threats and things that you see is really, really important. But sharing information also requires a lot of trust. It requires kind of bidirectional trust so that the people sharing information trust each other, or even omnidirectional trust, so that if you're all in the same ecosystem and you're sharing information, you got to believe that that's for the better, for the entire industry as a whole. And I don't necessarily think that that trust is there. And I think that needs to be built. And, we've tried some of these types of information sharing in the past, and it's broken down because, you talked a little about like kind of the regulator or regulated entity kind of relationship. You always feel like, hey, it's oversight. Someone's watching you. And if you were to share information, that could be negatively impacted on your organization. So how do you build a culture where information sharing is just an afterthought? You just have to do it. You have to collaborate. We're all in this together. And I think that's something, it's a great idea, but I think there are a lot of constraints to consider and overcome to really make that a reality and very successful.
Interesting, interesting. So what do you see as the biggest cybersecurity priorities for government today then?
So I really do think it's starting first and foremost with this culture of shared responsibility. And I think we've seen a couple of organizations recently be very proactive and share when they've been hit with cyber incidents and tell people what happened, even if that might have been to their own detriment, right? In some cases, because, sometimes people think, hey, it's better not to share, is to protect my shareholder value or do whatever, right? Or whatever it might be, until you absolutely, it's necessary and needed, or until you've absolutely confirmed something. We've been seeing a trend where people have not even confirmed and they're saying, hey, let me go off and share just because it's better for the community. It's better for the industry as a whole. We need to build that connection, right, in the industry to cultivate that shared responsibility. If we have that, Cliff, then I think now that starts really instigating the ability to drive information sharing and collaboration, right? And creating that bi-directional trust that I mentioned, or even omnidirectional trust as well, so that people feel like when they share, it benefits the entire industry. And I think, we are at a point now where cyber has become such a big risk issue that we have to believe that helping each other, right, is the right thing to do, and will actually advance, the industry for all of us collectively. And I really think that's going to be a giant priority, but then still, with some many constraints, as I mentioned earlier.
That's for sure. We've seen a number of publicized cyber attacks. I referenced one at the beginning of my preamble here this past year, including that hack into the Colonial Pipeline network, right? From my understanding, that was by way of a legacy VPN system that did not have multi-factor authentication in place at the time. So the first question on that one is, how prevalent or worrisome is single-factor authentication in government and industry? And then the second one is, beyond introducing multi-factor authentication, what actions can and should organizations take to best guard against such attacks?
Yeah, let's talk about kind of just single factor authentication. Unfortunately, but I still think it's fairly prevalent. I think, though, when it's prevalent, it's probably more in kind of the realm of shadow IT and things like that. I do think most organizations as a whole at the enterprise level have and are currently implementing multi-factor authentication. I think that's been pushed enough that it's a good thing to do. It's basic cyber hygiene. It's kind of a minimum best practice. And I think folks are doing that. I think where we've seen issues is, hey, I have this random server or a service that I'm leveraging, or something along those lines, where I continue to be amazed that, yeah, you'll still end up with credentials like admin/password, right? Things that just we know are not the right thing to do. The other thing I think that we are starting to evolve and consider is not all multi-factor authentication is the same, right? And different types of multi-factor authentication have their own unique vulnerabilities. They also have their own unique complexities around operations and maintaining them as kind of capabilities. And so I think those are all things to think about. NIST had published their digital identity guidelines a couple of years ago, NIST Special Publication 863. And within there, they talked about different assurance levels for authentication. I think very good guidelines for how you can raise your assurance levels. But I think ultimately, in general, I think multi-factor is being used. And I think, but it's really about deriving where maybe there are some of these very granular kind of use cases of shadow IT or other things that we need to consider more broadly. But I think what, you asked, well, what can we do, right? If we've implemented a multi-factor, et cetera, how can we continue to limit these risks? And I think that comes back to this concept of zero trust, right? And there's a lot of hype around zero trust right now. And we have a lot of vendors that are selling zero trust products and a lot of great technologies that are out there. And I'm a big proponent of all of them. However, there isn't a single zero trust solution for anyone. And also, I often tell my clients that, it's hard to implement zero trust at an enterprise level, right? There are some things you can implement enterprise level and they get propagated to enterprise. Zero trust has to be very, very specific, and you need to think about it at a very granular level, right? Think about the use case that you have. It could be something you're considering around, maybe it's an insider threat use case that you want to consider, or maybe it's something else. Then you think about all of the different technologies that you might layer in to actually execute kind of zero trust capabilities for that use case. Start small, right? And I think folks that are trying to think about broad scale zero trust, that's going to be really hard, and you're going to make mistakes, and you're probably not going to see the value. But if you can start small at a use case level and build your capabilities from there, from the bottoms up, I do think that that as a complement, so you can think about other capabilities that you need to have in operations to support, whether it's multi-factor authentication or any of the other great classic things that you should be doing from a cyber perspective. Then I think you start moving the needle and start complementing those things, and you start building up kind of your broader defenses. And so I do think, zero trust in that instance becomes a lot more prevalent and beneficial to an organization.
Taking it up sort of to the ERM level, because we're usually kind of thinking a lot about enterprise risk management capabilities and whatnot. So how does ERM and cyber risk management intersect and or converge, for that matter?
Yeah, I think that the convergence is more important than ever, right? At this point, I mean, you talked about some of these major events that are happening, out in industry, and cyber is just such a big part of an organization's and enterprise's risk posture. And I think even more importantly, and I don't want to just say cyber is the most important risk, because there's so many things that organizations face, right? In your role previously, right, as a chief risk officer, so many things you had to worry about, right? There was financial risk, there was brand risk, reputation risk, et cetera. But I think the reason why the convergence is important, Cliff, is how do you start articulating and contextualize cyber risks into those other terms? That's important for you, right? And for other leaders as chief risk officers to be able to provide that contextualization and that tailored understanding. I'll tell a quick story. I had a client once who was, I'll just say, right, the top leader at a very important government agency, right? And he was getting extremely frustrated with his cyber team and all of us too, right? As contractors supporting that team, saying, all you do every day is just tell me the doomsday scenario. You give me all these risks and tell me, oh, this is what could happen. Here's how someone could hack you. And here's what could happen. He's like, that's not helping me at all. It's not helping me prioritize. It's not helping me make decisions. He then simply asked a simple question. He said, Cliff, tell me, what are all these cyber risks that you're telling me? What is the risk to my mission? We couldn't answer that. You know why? Because we actually couldn't really translate it into mission terms. We couldn't translate into other kinds of components of their broader enterprise risk. And so I've then been telling folks then the important aspect of this convergence with enterprise risk is I layer into kind of these three concepts, right? And I think it parlays nicely into enterprise risk. First is around insights, which is, what do I know from a cyber perspective? And is there other data within the organization that may lead me to new insights? Not just cyber data, other data in the organization. Hence, again, why I would want to converge at enterprise level. Then the next question I ask is, now that I have insights, what type of understanding, right, can I derive from those insights? Because understanding is really, really important, right? Understanding could change for different stakeholders, right? I could get some cyber risk information, look at it, and it means something very different for me than maybe for Cliff, right? For you or anyone else kind of in this audience, you may look at that information differently. Also, each of us individually may look at that information differently for different situations or even different points in time, right? So one of my colleagues has been kind of pushing this concept of a prism, and I'll share the story, and I really like it, right? When you think about a prism, you shine a light on a prism and it refracts the light. As you rotate the prism, the light is refracted differently with a new view, and you see something completely differently. So think about every time you rotate a prism, every time you shine light, that's a different question you're trying to answer. It's something new that you're looking at, and it's tailored understanding that you have. And so that's why cyber is absolutely critical to be embedded into enterprise risks. So you can start asking those questions. You can start looking at cyber risks with different views, because ultimately that then empowers, whether you're a chief risk officer, a chief operating officer, or other executives across the board, to make decisions, to make risk-based decisions, to make situationally aware decisions, ultimately to then execute your missions, your businesses, et cetera, without suffering information paralysis. Because that's what we gave that previous client of mine. We paralyzed him. We just said it was a lot of cyber things that were bad. And he's like, I don't know what to do with this, right? But now if we can derive more insights, contextualize that information, that leads to action and decision-making, which is what every leader wants to be able to do.
And to follow up on that, again, this whole notion of integrated risk management is something that I'm very fond of. We don't do enough of that either at the corporate level, or I think at the government level, in terms of synthesizing the fact that these various risks that are in our risk taxonomies, be it a credit risk and some other type of operational risk, cyber risk, these things do collide with each other at times, and oftentimes they collide at the worst moment, right? You look at the cascading of events that happen with any of these major sort of headline types of cyber events, and I think you find that we collectively need to kind of get our arms better around the governance, the integration of cyber risk into our governance practices, getting that information, right, as you said, for that senior leader there, escalated in the proper manner up to whatever risk committees and other forums that they have to make those decisions in real time. So that's like job one, it seems like to me, and that. So that everything you're saying there just totally resonates with me. We have seen some significant disruptors, right, over the course of the past year in how we work. All the work from home, again, whether it's universities that had to go online, whether it's government agencies that had to send their workforces back home for a period of time during the pandemic, et cetera, to execute their organization's mission. And so clearly this has caused disruption from a cyber perspective, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, simply said, right, the boundaries between work and home have disappeared, right? So here I am working at home, and, the traditional boundaries that we all thought we had just don't exist, right? So enterprises are now an extended enterprise. As I mentioned earlier, supply chains are becoming increasingly complex. Services are distributed too, right? So most things that an organization is leveraging as a service, they may not be in your direct control or purview, right? So that introduces risk, that introduces variables that just maybe you don't understand. And I think because of all this, so now you have a more complex ecosystem. You also have more complex use cases of user behavior, right? So one of the things that we used to do in cyber is we try to look at user behaviors, and we thought we could get smart on certain things. So here's an example of something pre-pandemic we might have thought as a malicious use case, which is if I have an administrator working on my systems and they worked in a certain shift, but then I saw them logging in outside of their shift. You might say, well, why are they doing that? Are they doing something they shouldn't be doing? Do I need to check into that? Are they on call? Have they been asked to support an issue? Or is that kind of maybe an insider issue that I need to be worried about? Well, these days, work schedules have changed. Everyone's working a little bit differently. Home life is maybe, a little chaotic. And so you still need to get your work done. So that use case may no longer be, malicious anymore. You may have people working at different points in time, or people working from different places, right? There may be organizations that track, where are you coming in from? Are you coming in from, a secure connection or whatnot? And, with all of us, and we're working everywhere, and, some of those cases may not be malicious at any point, right? And so how do you delineate, benign behavior from malicious is a lot tougher now. And I think we have to kind of recalibrate a lot of that telemetry, and other things across the board to make sense of what things that we have, and in a really to drive true understanding within an environment. And so I think that means, thinking about other capabilities that we might need to derive. You were talking about VPNs earlier and other things, and propagating some zero trust solutions. Those are some things I think we should be considering. And I think we have to kind of completely put continuous monitoring on its head and rethink what that looks like, and have different use cases, and analyze data possibly in a different way as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I want to touch on this one as a follow-up. The parallel to, let's say, one part of my old business was in the credit card side. We've used for a long time various types of machine learning, AI types of capabilities to understand consumer behavior, right? So you go to the gas pump, you put your card in. If you're, right down the street from where you live, it knows not to necessarily ask you for the 5-digit zip code, because it knows your behavior. You go, somewhere that you haven't been before or something, and it's going to be more likely to do that. And that's all based on, behavioral analysis and machine learning techniques that are really kind of triangulating on your usage patterns. So how much of that is are we using that today, I guess, in the cyber risk domain? Is that coming about? I mean, machine learning, after all, has kind of been something that we're seeing like waves of work being dedicated to.
Yeah, we still absolutely are, right? I think just the models continue to evolve and change to that point, right? Even as you were talking about credit card fraud or whatnot. I used to always tell the story, right? Prior to the pandemic, as I looked at kind of my stock portfolio, I never really traded stocks or did anything. I would just go in every once in a while, log in, scroll down to the left-hand side, and just see like, well, what are my positions today? If you look at kind of behavioral biometrics and, user behavior, that would be Tim Lee's behavior. If Tim Lee logged in and didn't do that, it's probably not Tim Lee. But since the pandemic's happened, I've been researching some stocks, doing some other things. So I'm probably clicking some other things across the board. But, entire industries have been disrupted. You were talking about credit cards. I mean, think about mortgages, right? Digital signatures. Mortgages, closings are all happening just online now, right? Using, online e-signatures and things like that. That didn't happen before. You went in the office and you signed on, how many times did you have to sign, on the papers? And all those things have been disrupted, but that also means both opportunities, right? To introduce new technologies that are frankly great and very secure, but then also introduces potentially some risks as well to consider, right? And so, how do I know I'm making sure I'm sending that mortgage application, et cetera, to the right person? Because all they gave me was an email address. Well, things to think about, right? And so, do you have the models? Do you have rule sets to, understand some of these new use cases? I think those will be things that will need to continue to evolve. And we've just kind of accelerated that, right, over the last 18 months or so. To have to evolve those things very quickly.
That is interesting. The part of risk management, good effective risk management, is kind of identifying the risk, trying to kind of get ahead of things. So, what do you see as some of the new trends coming in, in the cyberspace, and or may dominate the headlines in the next couple of years that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah. So I think in the next couple of years, there's going to be more of a prevalent concept of what I would say are signals and leading indicators. And what I mean by that, Cliff, is this, right? Because the world, whether we like it or not, it's shrinking. And what I mean shrinking is we're more connected. We're more tied to each other than ever before. And so I introduced this concept that I kind of branded, which is this idea of users as a connection. And so this is what I mean by that. So let's say you're a commercial retailer and you're a federal agency. You may think those two entities have no direct connection or relationship, and they might not. But what if both of those entities let you self-register with credentials that are common? Well, if you were to do that, if the retailer were to be hacked with those credentials, the agency, the federal agency with those common credentials, may also be at risk of exposure. I tell this story because I actually, as a cyber professional, was guilty of this for about 30 minutes when I used the same credentials as my Amazon account as I had for my IRS account where I pay my taxes, until I quickly realized, well, probably not something I want to do. And I changed that account. So by that, I, as a user, created a connection, in that case, between Amazon and IRS that linked the two organizations, where frankly, they each individually were probably oblivious and had not consented to that connection, right? And so think about other things. And so I think about wearables and other things that continue to propagate in our world today, right? That's another way that I think users of connection is going to get worse and proliferate. So I have my, online watch here, right? I may go to the coffee shop. It jumps on the coffee shop's network because I was in a coffee shop one day. I go to the gym. Maybe they have a network there because I was tracking something. It jumps on the network there. Then I go into work. It jumps on the network there. Basically, right, in short, I, as a user, am creating my own little mini ecosystem that evolves like something in nature with Darwinian consequences. And I do this anew regularly, almost every day, right? That potentially becomes chaos. So one of the things I think that we should be looking at, right, in industry, and I think that will be coming, is how do we recognize this type of intersectionality, right? How do I start being able to curate, share, consume some of these advanced risk signals that are leading indicators for organizations to proactively turn those unknown risks into known risks? And that's tough, right? Because you don't want to have a situation where you're invoking on people's rights from a privacy perspective or other things. But I think there is a lot of power that can be had in looking at the ecosystem and looking at behaviors that might be leading indicators that, hey, this thing happened really, really far away, I think, but you know what? Actually, let me send a risk signal to a consortium, to a group to say, you know what, you should take a look at this and be worried about it. That's, I think, an interesting concept that will come. It's going to require a lot of governance, a lot of decisions around how you use data, what it can be used for, et cetera. But I do think it's a concept that will pick up, with a lot more momentum going forward as people really start thinking about what's next, right? Because it's no longer just about kind of your known ecosystem, your known supply chain, other things. It's about deriving some of those unknown factors just so you can be wary of them and then be empowered to then understand and try and make decisions if you think you need to.
I think you've done a great job of kind of characterizing some of these things that are out there, particularly as you just described in your own example of your Apple Watch or whatever. And I guess it does bring me back to, the emerging technologies that are out there, right? Self-driving cars, whatever it might be. I mean, how does that relate to some of the, the cyber threat potential that we could see out there with these technologies, these emerging technologies?
Yeah, and I think we highlighted some of this a little bit earlier, Cliff, in the sense that innovation is both something that cyber professionals need to embrace, right? Because it can be beneficial, right? Whether it's AI, ML, you were talking about those things and how we leverage that, blockchain, quantum, right? There's this whole premise in quantum where people are worried about, hey, are people just stealing encrypted data so that they can, kind of enable quantum capabilities down the road to decrypt that data? I mean, but, we have to think about some of those things. And so I certainly think there's leveraging innovation to benefit cyber, but then I think even more importantly, there is understanding the risk associated with innovation and how then do I manage the cyber risk associated with that innovation to not, like I said, stop things, but actually to really embrace innovation, to have all these things be risks to be managed, right? Again, I think all of the leaders on this call realize like how important that is. These aren't check-a-box things, right? There's no checklist that says here, do this or do that. They're risks to be managed. And all you want to know is understand them, make sense of them, and ultimately, right, you try and prioritize. And so I do think innovation, will be key. I think there's a lot of very interesting things coming on the cyber horizon, but I think it needs to be balanced with, us continuing to understand how we protect them as well. And think like the adversary, et cetera. And I think that will be really important.
So what do you think are, this is a $64,000 question for folks that are risk professionals. So what are best practices out there in managing cyber risk if you're at a federal agency or where have you?
Yeah. There's a lot of frameworks that out there, right, Cliff, right, for, implementing cyber, managing risk, right? You have things from NIST and, when you think about industry, right, it could be financial services. I got FFIEC frameworks. SEC now has their examination guides, and FINRA and others. And then, more when I think about industry, I think folks have probably heard about like CMMC, right, which is the cybersecurity model certification. And then there's certainly legacy frameworks like COBIT and others that folks still use. I, am a strong proponent of leveraging many of these because I think they all they're used for different reasons. And they can be rationalized also against each other because in the end, a lot of them are also very fundamentally common as well, right? A lot of them leverage some of the key concepts from the NIST cybersecurity framework or the NIST 853 security controls. But it's important to leverage them, kind of in different ways. But when I think about kind of ultimately how you do cyber risk management, I don't think it's necessarily explicitly a framework. Like I said, I still go back to this concept that I mentioned earlier of like insights to understanding to action. I liken this. So I took my first flight actually last week since the RSA conference last February 2020. So I had not gotten on a plane in about 18 months. And one of my favorite things, Cliff, I do when I get on a plane is I always like to peek into the cockpit. Why is that? I'm amazed by all the gauges and things that you see in the cockpit. I'm amazed at how a pilot can consume all of that stuff, right, that's in there in real time to keep us all safe and get us to our destinations, right, on time. And I liken that a little bit to what I see in cyber risk management too. Traditionally in cyber risk management, we have a lot of metrics. We have a lot of things that we have to report out on, whether to a regulator or to a government, inspector generals, whatever it might be. There's a lot of metrics. But, metrics and scores and things like that mean very different things to different people in different situations and different points of time. So how you can convert these frameworks to the right context, I think is really, really important, right? It's almost like, how do you, and this is not a framework, I recommend telling people to think about how you cultivate and curate some of these use cases for how maybe your brain synapses fire differently. So for example, if I go back to that, kind of plane analogy, I don't know, some folks may be familiar with the OODA loop, right? Which is kind of a classic fighter jet pilot kind of methodology, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. And I think there's a lot of premise in that can be applied in things that we do in risk management, right? You're observing, you're identifying as many different insights as you possibly can, right? You're deriving as much insights as you can from those gauges in that plane, right? Oriented, you're deciding, what does this mean to all of me, right? And for certain situations, you may look at 2 gauges, other situations, you may look at 3. That's a different use case. You don't always go in one certain direction. There's not one gauge that's going to give you the answer, right? And then because of all that, you then can now decide what you need to do and you can act on it. So if we can kind of build up an inventory of these different use cases in our brains to help our brains fire differently, to start thinking differently, I think that's really important because one of the things I think that has happened in the cyber industry is we often have become a little bit too siloed in our thinking, I believe. And that goes back to my analogy of why I love the convergence with enterprise risk management, because if you're very narrowly focused on cyber and the technical things, you're going to get too consumed by that, right? But if you start opening the aperture, right, to think about what this means, how this relates to other risks, now you start to create different observations, and that's going to create different decisions in the end. So, I know that's not explicitly a framework. I believe it's more a mentality of how we need to think. Because one of the things I continue to press is cyber shouldn't be just simply about frameworks. It's about changing your way of thinking. And I think thinking is really important. And that's why I always love working with chief risk officers and others, because I think they are some of our greatest thinkers. They really have to think about a bunch of different things. And so if you can take the technical minds, right, of our cyber professionals, complement that with the thinkers, now you're starting to hopefully create much better decisions and actions in the end.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm a simple-minded guy actually when it comes to these things, because the risks are so varied. You have specialists that work in these areas that know them, right? So I definitely am not an IT person or cyber person, engineer, or anything like that. I'm more on the finance side, but realize that you need those specialists to come in to provide that, that detailed understanding of that particular type of risk. As much as, you see the folks that are, doing credit risk analysis or whatever it might be at a bank. It kind of also, I think cyber risk is one of those risks, though, that's very different for anybody who's in the risk profession, from the standpoint of like exactly who owns the responsibility for managing cyber, reporting that up the chain, so to speak. Is it ERM? Is it IT? Is it some hybrid, something altogether different? What have you seen work the best in your experience?
Yeah, I think ultimately in the end, it probably needs to be a hybrid kind of responsibility. I think that traditionally, we would say, hey, the CISO within the organization holds a responsibility, and then that goes up to the CIO, and maybe the CRO gets awareness and some information related to it. I liken to what we see happening in a lot of industry in the commercial sector is it's a board level discussion, right? And it's an executive level discussion. And I think that's really where it needs to be as we see disruption. These aren't technology problems anymore. These are business problems, right? If I have a pipeline issue and that's impacting, half the country, it's a business mission problem, right? If I have, right, a food safety issue, that's a business mission impact problem. It's not just a technology problem. And so I think it's really important to elevate that. And we've seen some changes, right? I think, I've seen organizations where the CISO is now reporting to a CRO or reporting to a COO in that case, because maybe the COO is driving a lot of key decisions from an operational perspective. But in the end, I think it needs to be hybrid. I think every organization is unique in terms of its own governance. I think the best thing that we can do, though, is make sure we can translate the risk seamlessly amongst those different functions, so that so we're all, articulating the same risks, but maybe from different viewpoints. I think that becomes really, really important. But yeah, ultimately, I think a hybrid function would be best if an organization could potentially support that.
Terrific. We could go on and on, I think, for another hour, but we don't have another hour. What I'd like to do, Tim, is maybe kind of pivot a little bit to some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience, and kind of pose those to you if I could. And actually, this first one actually comes right on the tail of our last conversation here. And the question goes as follows: what has been your experience with CIO working with CROs on addressing cyber risk? And do you see tension between that CIO's office and the CRO on communicating and managing these shared risks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do often see tension, right, in that situation. And like I said, it's because there may be different perspectives and different viewpoints, right? The CIO is focused on technology, operations, keeping my technology running, et cetera. They may not be focused on things as prevalently, maybe in the brand, reputation, or other areas. Again, I say may not, right? I know every organization, every CIO or CRO may be different, but I think you often see that tension. And I think that's why it's really important to have this seamless capability to translate, cyber risk, for your teams and for your other stakeholders. So for example, the CIO talking to his teams, his or her teams, right, about risks may be very different than a CRO talking to his or her teams about the same risks. But when they talk to each other, they may be talking differently as well. And then when they go talk to their, most senior executive, they may be talking differently as well. And so, the more we can kind of frame out how we have these types of dialogues, how we tailor these views, that is really important. And those views are going to be infinite, right? I never want to tell people like it's an explicit playbook. This is how you talk to a CIO, or this is how you talk to a CRO. It's never that easy, because every CIO, CRO themselves is very different too, in their own savviness and in their own perspectives, right? The perspectives are important. That's why I think it's important to capture that. I think it's okay to recognize that there's tension. I think that represents an opportunity then to figure out how you can talk in a way and understand those different kind of viewpoints, and start translating, some of the risk information into that. It's not easy. That takes time, and we've taken, several of our clients on that journey, and I think it's very fulfilling when you're able to do that, because then you get a lot of aha moments, and you get people nodding their heads and saying, I want more of this, and now I understand where you're coming from. That leads to a much more productive dialogue than, I don't understand why you're making me go do this, right? Which is never, the conversation you want to have per se.
Yeah, again, I'm probably biased on this one, but I would probably be in the camp that would say, at some point, all of these different types of risks, right? That's why you have a CRO's office to begin with, or an ERM function, is that somewhere they have to sort of conversion come in so that you can start to have the integrated risk conversations about what we said just a few minutes ago, talking about these have business risk implications. They have other types of risk implications, maybe on the ops side or what have you. And I think the best forum for that, and again, I know there are many different, one size does not fit all, is usually having that come through, let's say, an enterprise risk committee, where that CIO alongside that CRO is there, and they can have these very technical, right? They can be, think of it like a, football commentary, right? You've got somebody who's doing the play-by-play. I think of that as a CRO, and you've got that color commentary specialist out there who's played this cyber risk game in the form of that CIO. You can come in and kind of very clearly paint that picture. So I'm with you on that. I think that's a tough one. I don't necessarily see that there's has to be tension around these things. I mean, we can talk about CIO versus CRO. I've seen CRO and CFO tension a lot more, I think, in my time. But certainly healthy tension is not necessarily a bad thing. Here's another question, and this is interesting, back to integration or intersection points of different risks. So what role does cyber risk play in the emerging risks around climate change? Now, you got two big ones there. So
yeah, no, I think climate, certainly a hot topic, right, for us at a global level. Where I see actually cyber coming into play most prevalently for climate, at least today, is around, I was talking earlier, classic cyber activities started off with information operations. And I think about all that is happening today around climate change, misinformation, disinformation, what is real, what is not. I think that's all going to be very, very important to try and distill. One of the things that we've started seeing, and this is not directly related to climate, but maybe I'll share just the trend that we've been seeing in the industry as a whole, is I think ever since the pandemic started happening, et cetera, a lot of organizations, government and others, have been outsourcing their consumption of information, right? They've been garnering a lot more information across the board. But by doing so, because used to be they would curate their own information, right? They would have their own information, and if you curate it, you trust it. But now you realize, I got to get more information, right? But then the question is, as you gather information, what information is deemed real and has the highest level of integrity, and what is not? And that's becoming a challenge, right? As you look at a whole life cycle, and this is no different than some of the concepts you see when you think about deep fakes or other things around imagery or whatnot. And I think all that can be propagated into here. Is there's always going to be folks that want to potentially disrupt things, right? For whatever reasons. And, I don't want to say that I am a climate change scientist and I know what the exact facts are, but I think what we don't want to have is explicitly false information either, because in the end, we want to have people be empowered information so you can have, the positive debate, right, around what things look like. And I do think huge concern around just these types of information operations campaigns that are happening more and more, that I think could disrupt, climate and other things. We saw the same things, right? Obviously, one example was the 2020 census, right? There was a lot of, narrative around the 2020 census. And so there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So, there was actually, a command center that was stood up to kind of look at some of those considerations. And I think we're seeing more and more of that across the board. And I know it's, trying to take some of the politics outside of this. I think there is, the cyber domain is so easy to propagate information. The internet, right? I talked about it earlier. Share information. We are very good at that. At an instant, share, and it gets consumed everywhere. Now, can we understand how that information, the full life cycle of information, can I trust that information, score that information, et cetera? That's where I see cyber kind of coming in to both identifying, detecting potential threats around information, and both also then to, assure the integrity of that information as well, whether it's leveraging capabilities like blockchain or other things to validate and say, yeah, this information is real. And that's not going to be one piece of technology, but I think it's going to be a bunch of things. And so hence, again, my premise earlier around the focus on integrity being a lot more and more important. I think that's going to be key as you think about climate change.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think back to that Equifax incident, right? And some of the downstream users, all those, again, not government necessarily, but certainly financial institutions that are highly reliant on the access to credit reporting information and the integrity of that feeding into all their various analytical systems for which they're making, lending decisions and offering different products and pricing and whatnot is, pretty concerning too. Want to be mindful of the time. I've got one more question I think I can get on the table for you here before we have to call it a morning here on this session. Culture is critically important to cyber. How do you balance people and technology when faced with cyber challenges? And I'll throw in there as an extra credit one, what types of backgrounds and skills would you be looking for in staffing up cyber risk management function at an organization?
Yeah, maybe I start with your extra credit first, because I really like that question. I think in this field, diversity is key. When I say diversity, it's everything. You need highly technical folks, but you need business and mission folks. And why? It's because of all these relationships that we talked about. I need to be able to communicate these risks and think about these risks differently. And I think in the end, I always tell people, if I can get folks to think in a certain way, then I can make them a very strong cyber professional. I want folks to challenge the status quo. I don't want folks to look at information in silos. I want them to ask the question, what if, and bring pieces of data together to tell you something else, right? I think all those things are really, really important, and you need to bring different teams together to bring that diversity of thought. And then, from a culture perspective, a couple things, right? I mentioned it is about thinking in a certain way. I think it is about that sense of shared responsibility that I referenced earlier, that all of us can make a difference and can change something, and to proactively share that with others, because that is really, really important. And finally, I think it's about embracing the change. I think change is good. I think people in cyber often try and say, well, change is bad because change means I have to figure things out again. Well, that just can't be the mindset. It's not a question, right? We just have to embrace change. We know we're going to continue to innovate. So keep the pace, or frankly, even more importantly, set the pace. That's why I said cyber should be about starting things. So if you set the pace around innovation, then you're going to feel a lot more comfortable as things are happening around you and being disrupted, that you can keep pace and understand the impact of that, and then bring that sense of shared responsibility. You bring the sense of the kind of diverse thought. Then I think collectively you're bringing together a fantastic team to really create culture and to execute your cyber risk management programs in a very effective way.
Well, that reminds me that I'll borrow from a phrase that I'm frequently using a lot these days. We're all risk managers. Well, in this case, maybe we're all cyber risk managers, or we have to be more risk aware of these things. So Tim, in the interest of kind of closing this out, thank you so much. These were quite illuminating comments and views today. So thank you again. Thanks to the Deloitte team for working with us on these programs, as I said, and look forward to having more discussions with you on this. And thank you to the audience as well. Many, many thanks, and we'll see you in a very future version of this. I think the next one of our Federal Risk Academy webinars is coming up this fall is going to be on climate change of all topics. So thanks again, everybody.